Buongiorno a tutti, sono Domenico Lombardi del Center for International Governance Innovation. Benvenuti a questo incontro su economia globale e complessità. Richiamando il tema della 37esima edizione del meeting Tu sei un bene per me, l'interazione a livello globale dal secondo dopoguerra ad oggi ha generato una straordinaria crescita e abbiamo una straordinaria crescita cui abbiamo assistito in varie parti, in varie regioni del mondo, anche se non in tutte. Eppure oggi stiamo anche assistendo a una ondata di antiglobalizzazione che si manifesta non tanto nella periferia del mondo, ma in quei paesi che sono il centro economico e finanziario dell'economia globale e che hanno tanto beneficiato della globalizzazione e della finanziarizzazione dell'economia mondiale negli ultimi decenni. È indicativo, per esempio, che nel Regno Unito le regioni che hanno beneficiato in larga misura di fondi dell'Unione Europea abbiano votato contro la permanenza del Regno Unito nella stessa Unione, e negli Stati Uniti si tende ad attribuire alla globalizzazione problemi e fenomeni che hanno un'origine assai complessa, e probabilmente la scarsa comprensione del fenomeno dell'economia globale che rende problematico governare la sua dinamica, e di questo ne parleremo con un pool di relatori che vengono da vari background, da vari continenti, ma che hanno tutti maturato un'esperienza di carattere mondiale con la quale spero in questa sessione ci aiuteranno a decifrare il tema di questo incontro, economia globale e complessità. Passo ora a introdurre i relatori. Alla mia sinistra c'è l'ambasciatore Daniele Mancini, ambasciatore presso la Santa Sede, prima dell'attuale incarico di ambasciatore presso la Santa Sede. L'ambasciatore Mancini è stato ambasciatore in India, ambasciatore in Romania, ha ricoperto incarichi di rilievo nelle ambasciate italiane a Washington, Islamabad, Parigi, Baghdad, ed è stato consigliere diplomatico nel Ministero dello Sviluppo Economico, Commercio Internazionale, Energia e Comunicazioni, e ha ricoperto importanti incarichi presso il gabinetto del Ministro degli Esteri e presso la Presidenza della Repubblica. Nella sua attività di diplomatico ha ricevuto numerose onorificenze, cito solo la più recente, quella di Cavaliere di Gran Croce dell'Ordine al Merito della Repubblica, di cui è stato insignito questo stesso anno. He Fan è il Chief Economist del Pyongyang Institute of Finance, della Renmin University, dell'Università di Renmin a Pechino, una delle primarie università in Cina e una delle università con la quale il nostro think tank collabora, e infatti ero proprio a Pechino giorni fa prima di venire a Rimini. He Fan è anche Senior Fellow dell'Institute for New Economic Thinking, un think tank che ha sede a New York e che ha appunto come obiettivo quello di sviluppare un nuovo approccio all'economia, e in precedenza è stato vice direttore dell'Istituto per l'Economia e la Politica Mondiale dell'Accademia Cinese delle Scienze Sociali. He Fan è l'autore di numerose pubblicazioni, è un ricercatore estremamente prolifico, è anche consulente del Ministro delle Finanze, del Ministero del Commercio, della Banca Centrale Cinese, è membro del gruppo di Bellaggio, che è un gruppo informale di banchieri centrali e di esperti di altissimo livello. Alla mia estrema destra c'è Amar Bhattacharya, che è Senior Fellow della Brookings Institution. Il dottor Bhattacharya è stato in precedenza segretario generale del gruppo dei 24, che È un'organizzazione cui membri sono i ministri delle finanze, i governatori di banche centrali dei paesi emergenti e in via di sviluppo, e prima ancora è stato per molti anni consigliere del Presidente della Banca Mondiale, lavorando sempre su questioni di global governance e rappresentando la Banca Mondiale in una serie di consessi internazionali come il G7, il G20 e altri consessi ancora. Ecco, questo per sottolineare quello che dicevo all'inizio. È un panel con relatori che hanno acquisito un'esperienza preziosa e che ci aiuteranno ad elaborare su questo tema molto complesso che gli organizzatori del meeting hanno voluto appunto che noi discutessimo, su economia globale e complessità. E quindi passerei la parola all'ambasciatore Mancini.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti, buongiorno al dottor Lombardi, grazie per l'invito, buongiorno ai dottor Bellasciavia e al dottor Fanhe. Lieto di essere qui al meeting, non è la mia prima esperienza e sono venuto in passato sovente ed è sempre una bella esperienza tornare perché si incontrano volti di amici e al tempo stesso anche si incontrano nuove persone. Non mi addentrerò, lo dico subito, il mio statement iniziale è proprio questo, non mi addentrerò specificamente sul terreno economico perché lo lascerò fare ai colleghi molto più qualificati che sono alla mia destra. Mi intratterrò invece con voi con alcune riflessioni sulla complessità, sul tema della complessità di per sé, aiutato in parte perlomeno dal percorso professionale ormai lungo che ho alle spalle, che mi ha insegnato che appunto è importante parlare ma è anche importante ascoltare, mai nulla è definitivo, mai nulla è completamente bianco o completamente nero e per dirla come la diceva Romano Guardini, occorre essere degli uomini che camminano solitari, quindi avere la capacità di distaccarsi dagli eventi per poter avere lo sguardo lungo, la visione olistica. E soprattutto è un tema che la problematica dell'immigrazione oggi ci ricorda, che un uomo è sempre un uomo, quale che ne sia il colore della pelle, è sempre e ovunque un essere umano. Il tema che ci è proposto oggi è un tema di grandissima, di straordinaria importanza e una delle tesi che svilupperò questa mattina con voi è che proprio tutto sommato è spesso quello che ci manca è proprio l'interpretazione culturale della dimensione globale del mondo nel quale viviamo, di cui l'economia è una componente ma non è la totalità del mondo che abbiamo sotto le mani e davanti agli occhi. I punti di riferimento in questa rapida cavalcata con voi sono i seguenti. Non è complessa l'economia globale, è complesso il mondo di cui oggi l'economia è divenuta la forza motrice. Ecco, se io dovessi andare via adesso a questo punto di questa rappresentazione vi avrei comunque lasciato il mio messaggio. Si dice, anche nel titolo che ci è proposto, economia globale e complessità, non è complessa l'economia, è complesso il mondo di cui l'economia rappresenta oggi la forza motrice, ma che non esaurisce la gamma delle relazioni che abbiamo di fronte a noi. Viviamo poi in una fase del post-tutto, del dopo-tutto. Abbiamo globalizzazione e antiglobalizzazione, abbiamo avuto marxismo e abbiamo avuto liberalismo, abbiamo avuto sviluppo e sottosviluppo. Oggi la realtà, ricordiamo quanto McLuhan diceva all'inizio degli anni 60, quando sviluppò per primo il concetto del villaggio globale. Ecco, oggi viviamo non in un villaggio, ma viviamo in un mondo, e quindi non stiamo parlando di poche migliaia di persone, ma stiamo parlando di miliardi, di più di 7 miliardi di persone che interagiscono tra di loro continuamente a tutti i livelli. Quindi è un mondo molto difficile da comprendere, da interpretare e da indirizzare, da governare. La politica, le classi dirigenti hanno perduto, non per propria responsabilità, ma anche proprio specificamente per la complessità di questo scenario, hanno perduto la capacità di comprendere e di indirizzare le scelte, soprattutto, ma non esclusivamente quelle economiche, e oggi l'agenda è soprattutto
And this is something that is to do with the classes that exist, and we can have a series of policies that can be the right ones. In order to define what Jacques Attali, the Chancellor of President Mitterrand, called the horizons, that is to say, what can be seen on the line of the horizon. So we have the need, but at the same time we are not capable of making this change. We have to make a quality leap. We need to start thinking in a different way from what we have been doing up to now. So my thesis is that this problem we have, this stalemate, we need to reconceptualize our world, the liquid world, as the Pope and the sociologist Bauman says. So I will try to if we talk about so let's see how we have to work on this phenomenon of complexity. There are so many experts that have actually reflected on this, as the French François Morgan, who said we should be more interdisciplinary. We should develop a transdisciplinary, a cross-disciplinary approach. We should go beyond the vision that was based on Cartesius, and that is a basis at of our work in the West. So either you study as a lawyer, as an engineer, as a philosopher. Well, reality is much more complex than this. Reality, in spite of the fact that we use the word complex to indicate something that is very structured and sometimes dark, obscure. So we should try and recreate these concepts which sometimes made us divide what we have, and we have in a way lost the unitary fact that well, we have many different aspects, and there are so many different things that we have to take into account. So this is a feeling that goes against the system. This is something that proposes a new, different system. And while we are not trying to change the existing model, And globalization brings about a lot of opportunities, but it is perceived today as an element of crisis. The hypertrophy of finance, this hyperfinancialization of economy, the theme of disequality, of increasing problems on the welfare state. After 1945, then migrant flows, the religious factor, fundamentalism, the this utopia. We were better off in the past. That's what our grandparents, our parents used to say. And these, aspects that go against our idea, the small things. So we are, let's think about what happened about 10 years ago. We had this populist aspect. Today, they have the same weight, and the populist literature, as we see, shows so this is actually the lack of the propulsion strength of liberal and democratic forces. So this is the end of a high vision of politics. Here there is a very beautiful exhibition I visited this morning on the foundation of the Italian Republic. So it's enough to look at the hope in the eyes of those poor people who really believed in the future, the same future they were shaping with their own hands. So this is a social contract, so to speak, between the government and the people, which no longer works today. So we have this crisis in terms of international order. There are different aspects that are very aspects, negotiations after the failure in Copenhagen and the Kyoto Compromise and the negotiation on the nuclear, the Agenda 2030, and then there are other aspects that are terrible in terms of desegregation, Bataclan, Twin Towers, Brexit. So this is the same problem that the international organizations have. 20 years ago, Benjamin Barber is someone I met a few years ago, and he wrote a very enlightening book called Word versus Jihad. So he was talking about the jihad 20 years ago already. Today I work there are disgregation forces at work in the world and aggregation forces. So, so we don't know whether the world will take one direction or the other. So that was an aspect that has changed. So we have the old paradigm of international order, that is the dream of all diplomats. The Yalta system, G2, BRICS. So all the elements that bring about stability in the system, but those orders no longer exist today. Since, when there was no international order, Kissinger used to say there was a war. The 30 Years' War, the 100-year war, then the First and the Second World War. So in order to bear fruits, an international order needs to be accepted. If you do not accept it, if you have a contradictory position towards the international order, well, it goes against certain aspects and the order is challenged. So in order to accept, there is the rule of the thumb. You need to have a certain kind of aspects, the Roman Empire, Great Britain, the United States. Well, today we no longer have an accepted order. We just have a world where another American scholar, Charles Skupchin, wrote a beautiful book a few years ago, and I really invite you all to read it. It's called No Man's World. This is a world that is actually going along without being controlled. It's a train with no one sitting in the driving position. So, there are no certainties that this train will not crash. I don't think I'm in the position to make recommendations, but if I should, I would say we should not take globalization for granted, and let's not think that we are talking about deglobalization, because it's not so easy to get off this train I was talking about before, because it never stops in no stations. This implies a responsibility for each of us. So in order to go along in this world, with this multipolar, multi-religious world, we need to have an integrated version that can create a new alliance between disciplines, between knowledge, man and nature. With my work, I represent Italy at the Holy Seat, and there is this beautiful encyclical letter he wrote last year, Laudato Si, where he reminds us that everything is put together. We are citizens of the same world, and all the species populating the planet have the same rights and the same duties. So, especially we human beings. So we need to be brave, we need to be open. So I invite all the young people that are present here today. You have to be pilgrims, pilgrims of wisdom, pilgrims in search of the truth. You need to think out of the box, But this calls for a lot of imagination. It calls for a cross-disciplinary approach, and it calls for the development of a strategy in the long term, a new mental map. We have to free ourselves from the paradigms of the 19th century. We have to find a loyal intergenerational pact, as Pope Benedict XVI used to say. When we visit the cathedrals in Europe or the temples in India or China, those extraordinary two countries, well, these buildings were started in a generation and was finished by another one. So, well, it was a multi-generational investment. And this is exactly what we want to do if we are still in time for doing that. We need to start and think in multi-generational terms, and I do believe this is extremely important. And then we need to move from the concept of growth to development. I'm sure the colleagues will dwell on that. So, well, it's more than the increase in the GDP. No, it's not only that. We need to have a common we need to have a common feeling. We need to have empathy. We need to have organized communities. So we do not want a Washington consensus, but we do not want even a Beijing consensus. We want a human consensus. Human beings need to become global players. And I conclude by saying we need a way to find our way in the future. So what we need to understand is that we need to perceive the interactions existing between the political, economic, and cultural dimensions, as well as the social dimension. They need to be bound together closely, as the Rome Club 50 years ago that said that this is the great transition. And this is exactly what we're doing. But the failure or the success of this transition goes through the cultural assimilation of the following factors: the big economic, social issues. No country, no interest group, no multinational company can react individually. Today's we need collective, joint responses, reactions, and in the different phases, when we are at a loss, we need to have some, certain leaders who can really help us. We can understand that there is a need for change. And then, the very last recommendation on my part, we need to be ready to look at what we do in a critical way and change our opinion in a constructive way. The changes that take place every day need to be something we can react to. So we have to travel light. We at the Italian Embassy, at the Holy Seat, on September the 21st this year, we will organize a conference with the Pontifical Academy of Culture entitled For a More Inclusive Economy, with the Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton and other university professors. So the idea here is to study these complexity parts.
La ringrazio, ambasciatore, per questa relazione.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this contribution, which I think is well connected with the speeches that we are going to hear. And I'll leave the floor now to Fan He, And then
Grazie. Thank you. It's a great honor to be invited here for this remaining meeting. I have to admit I haven't attended any meeting like the remaining meeting. It is very amazing and unique. And I think that in the future, I hope there will be more Chinese scholar and Chinese entrepreneur to come to Rimini. And I think they will come because China is a country has a long history, and we like countries that has long history like Italy and also India. I have prepared a PowerPoint for this session, but because of tight time constraint, I think I'd better to skip the slides, and I will talk very briefly um, on the Chinese economy, so the relationship between China and the global economy, and the implications for Italy and for global economy. Well, in the last 2 decades, we witnessed a rapid expansion of the Chinese economy. And some people say it's the China's miracle. It is a miracle because in less than 20 minutes, China becoming the world factory, a powerhouse of manufacturing in the world. And we have tried that before. So in the 1950s to 1970s, and China tried to develop heavy industry at a backdrop of Cold War, because heavy industry will lay the foundation for the build-up of your military power. But heavy industry is capital intensive. So imagine that a poor country like China try to develop heavy industry. We cannot rely on market economy. So we end up with a Soviet Union type planned economy. And at the first stage, it worked. It seemed to work pretty well, but then gradually it has been proved more and more inefficient. And started from 1980s, we started to reform the domestic economy, and a lot of small company, we call it town and village enterprises, mushroomed. It's the small private company, very much like the small family company in Italy. Um, but we are not very successful by only reforming the domestic economy, because in this small company, they cannot produce the high-ended products. So their products are mainly sold in the domestic market. And what happened is in 1990s and early 21st century, when China started to opening up, uh, to have the opening up policy and then be integrated into the global economy. And a milestone of China's opening up is China's entry into the WTO in year 2000. And at that time, it was a very controversial issue, because a lot of people say, well, by opening up to foreign competitor, and then Chinese company were doomed. A very famous Chinese entrepreneur warned his colleagues that we have we had better to be prepared to dance with the wolves. Wolf means foreign companies. But then after China's entry into the WTO, it turned out to be Chinese company themselves are wolves. And Chinese company are very competitive even by international standards. And why this happened? I think one is because the change of the trade pattern. So the trade pattern has been changed from the traditional inter-industrial trade. For example, like one country produce clothes and shoes, and then another country produce airplane. So we sell our shoes in exchange for the airplane produced by other country. So that's the traditional trade pattern. And a new trade pattern is the so-called intra-industrial trade. So for every product, every industry, the China may have its niche in that supply chain. So we can start it from those like the assembling, which needs the more unskilled labor, and we started from the assembling, and then we can uh, climb up the ladder of this supply chain. And, and so this is the economic foundation. And the political parameter is at that time, other country, especially the United States, they try to try to engage China. So their thinking is by introducing China to the world trade system, and then China will become a good student of the current international system. And yes, we did that. We did that pretty well. And the most fundamental thing is at that time, the comparative advantage of Chinese economy is we have a huge pool of cheap, unskilled labor. So by integrating into the global economy and by joining the global division of labor, and we can utilize those human resources in China. But this is not the happy end of the story. Um, and we have to, because success is the mother of failure, so we have to make a greater transformation of the Chinese economy. Why? Because the seemingly successful trade pattern is not sustainable. And first, because in China we have a very low consumption ratio, but very high saving. And the saving is high because of precautionary saving, because there's no well-functioning social safety network in China. So Chinese household, they because of the uncertainty in the future, and they have to put aside a big chunk of their income for the consumption in the future. And if an economy has very high saving rate but very low consumption, and then you have a trade surplus, and we accumulated a huge amount of foreign exchange reserve, and now we are using this money to buying T-bills in the United States, where the return is almost zero. So it is a, So it is at this backdrop that Chinese government try to transfer the Chinese economy, and then to move to a new trajectory uh, for a more balanced and more sustainable development pattern. But then it's easy to say but difficult to do because we have more constraints. So what it constrained the Chinese policymaker is now facing up with is what I called a trilemma of Chinese economy. Is so for the Chinese policymaker, and they have three most important policy goals. And one is economic growth, And second is employment. So you have to provide enough job opportunity for the Chinese people. And third is financial stability. So we don't want to have uh, a Lehman Brothers type financial crisis in China. So all these three policy goals are all very important. But the 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 uh, the complexity of the Chinese economy is if you take one policy goal and then you may have conflicts with the other two goals. For example, if Chinese government think high growth is the most important goal, and then the most convenient way that we can achieve high growth is we continue to use the traditional growth model, which means that we have to rely on investment, government investment. So the government has to injecting more money in the building of infrastructures. But then infrastructure building is capital intensive, so it can boost up your GDP growth rate, but it has difficulty to create enough jobs. And and also, as what happened after the global financial crisis, and China adopted the 4 trillion stimulus policy. And the good thing is that it helped China to avoid a hard landing, but it created a lot of problem like overcapacity and the accumulation of non-performing loans in the Chinese banking system. So it may also hurt the financial stability if you use the traditional growth model. And if the Chinese government think that employment is the most important goal, and what they can do is to unleash the financial sector, because the service sector, because the service sector is now the largest employer in China. A lot of people say that because manufacturing sector in China is now slowing down, so by developing the service sector, we can replace the engine. That we can still maintain a very high economic growth. But that will not happen because if you look at the growth rate of productivity in the manufacturing sector, and then you compare that in the service sector, and the growth of productivity in manufacturing sector is way higher than that in the service sector. And it's easy to understand if you want to buy a smartphone and then you buy iPhone 5, iPhone 6, and then within half a year, and you are expecting that you have a iPhone 7 or iPhone 8. So for those manufactured products, they can be updated very quickly. But it will not happen in the service sector, especially in the traditional service sector. That if you have a nanny in your family, you cannot expect that the nanny will update from nanny 1.0 to nanny 2.0 within half a year. So the implication is with the higher share of service in Chinese economy, the potential growth rate in China will inevitably continue to slow down. But the good thing of developing service sector is it can provide enough jobs, not only for the unskilled labor, but also for the skilled labor, those who educated in universities and colleges. But then, as I said, that if they are working on the reform of the service sector, and probably the potential growth rate will continue to fall. And at the same time, the financial system in China is not yet well prepared for this change of economic structure. The traditional clients of China's banking sector is mainly manufacturing companies. And this business model works pretty well because when manufacturing company come to banks and ask for loans from the banks, and the banks will require collaterals. And the manufacturing company, they do have collaterals, and they have house, they have office, and they have land, they have equipment, so they have everything. And then the cash flow for those manufacturing company is very stable. So the economic, the industrial structure, and then the financial structure in China matches pretty well in the past. But then if you want to develop the service sector, and you have a lot of new startup in the service sector, and then they come to the banking sector and ask for loans, and the banks do not know how to do with them. It is true that at the end of the day, there will be a lot of very successful service company, like in China, uh, the internet company like Alibaba and Tencent. Yeah, they are more successful than most manufacturing companies. But how can but how can you tell which one finally will succeed? 20 years ago, if a young man called Ma Yun come to the Chinese bank and say, "I want to have this Alibaba," how can you how can you tell whether he will success or not? How can you distinguish which company will be Alibaba and which one will be Alimama? So probably we will end up with more non-performing loans with the further development of the service sector in China. Okay, and if the government think, we need to worry about the loans and the non-performing loans and the local government debt, and we are worrying about the possibility of a potential financial crisis, and they need to reform China's banking system. In one reason why we have a potential financial risk is because the leverage ratio in China is very high. So you look at the other part of the world. You look at what happened in the United States, what happened in Japan, what happened in Europe. After the global financial crisis, they all have this very painful deleverage. Uh, but then in China, after the global financial crisis, the leverage ratio increased rather than decreased. So this is the reason why Chinese government now they have listed several most important tasks for structural reform, and one of them is deleverage. But then imagine that you force all the companies to deleverage in a time when there's slowing down of the economic growth, and it can very easily trigger downside spiral and invite a financial crisis. But then if we do not do this, and probably there will be more non-performing loans and the accumulation of local government debt. And finally, we have to deal with all these problems. So what's the morals of China's story to Italy? Uh, well, first, I'm here to remind my Italian friends that Italy is not the only country which has problems. And we also have a lot of problems. All happy economies are alike, and unhappy economy are unhappy in their own way. If you have a chance to be in the position as the premier in China for only one day, and you feel so lucky that you are an Italian, not a Chinese.
Devo dire, sareste un oggetto che vi sentireste molto felici e fortunati di essere italiani, non cinesi.
And second lesson for Italy and other country is that China learned from its own experience that globalization is good for all the country, especially for developing country. So China is one of the beneficiary of this rapid globalization in the last several decades. And when there is the backlash of globalization happened in other part of the world, China now try to stand up as the main supporter of globalization.
In cui la globalizzazione ha avuto altri tempi e adesso la Cina si sta facendo leader, diciamo così, della globalizzazione.
I think it really needs some guts to stand up at this moment to defend globalization.
Ci vuole un bel coraggio a farsi sostenitori della globalizzazione in un momento come questo.
And in order to make globalization works, I think for the other country, there needed to be more engaging or even better encouragement from other countries and to help China and to work together with China and then to find new solutions how to deal with the increasing complexity of the global economy. Be- because the problem we are facing is very often global. So we need to find a solution not at the country level and not at the regional level, but at the global level. So in this sense, I think the main theme of the remaining meeting and the unique format of this remaining meeting is very, very important and can helpful to foster the mutual understanding of people in different countries from all different aspects.
E questo per molti diversi aspetti.
Okay, I'll stop here.
Ti ringrazio Fan per averci
Thank you, Fan He, for this experience from China. And now I would like to call Amar Bhattacharya for his contribution.
Let me also begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this meeting. It's my first time, but it is really an experience, as you can feel as you walk through these corridors. And it is a real pleasure to share this panel with my esteemed colleague Domenico, Lombardi, with Ambassador Mancini and Van He. I'm going to focus on 4 issues. How do we get the global economy out of this deep doldrums that it has been stuck in? Second, what is the future of globalization? Building on what Ambassador Mancini said. Third, how do we live within the planetary boundaries and cope with climate change? And fourth, how do we deliver on the promise of the 2030 Development Agenda that was adopted by world leaders last September? Each of those I could speak for an hour on, but I will speak for 5 minutes on each. So on the global economy, the growth that we are experiencing in 2016 is about the slowest that we have seen, not just since the financial crisis, but in the last 2 decades. Underlying it, though, is extraordinary variation across countries and extraordinary ups and downs. To give you an example, the United States grew by just 1% in the first quarter of 2016, but now there is a sense that growth will rebound quite sharply, not just in the second quarter, but for the rest of the year. In contrast, in the euro area, growth was quite strong at 2%, but there is a sense that growth will now decline perhaps quite sharply in the aftermath of Brexit. And in the United Kingdom, most economists expect a recession in 2016. In Japan, growth was 2% in the first quarter of 2016, but expectations are that growth will decelerate. What is also striking is that emerging markets and developing countries are now being brought into the vortex of low growth. Two of the major BRICS countries, Brazil and Russia, are in recession. Growth is virtually still in South Africa. And as we heard from Van He, growth in China has been decelerating. But at 6.7% is still the most important source of stimulus to the global economy. The only large emerging market that is showing very robust growth is my own, India, where growth is close to about 8%. So what is it that is needed to stimulate the global economy at this juncture? We know that monetary policy is extraordinary in advanced economies in degree of easing, but it is reaching its limits, and you could argue is having some perverse effects in terms of build-up of risks. In emerging markets, monetary policy is not actually an effective tool because risks of spillovers on financial instability. With respect to fiscal policy, there is still an ongoing debate on fiscal austerity. Those countries that have room for fiscal space are reluctant to use it, and most countries, including, for example, Italy, do not have much room. So everybody is talking about structural reforms, and even in the G20, this year there will be a commitment on enhanced structural reforms. Structural reforms are good, but they are not magic bullets, and they will not produce big stimulus in the short run. So some of us are pushing for a fourth way forward, and that is for focusing on investment, especially focused on sustainable infrastructure. In advanced economies, aging of infrastructure poses an opportunity to scale up investments. And in emerging markets and developing countries, there is a huge need for infrastructure spending. Current interest rates, which are extraordinarily low, and technological opportunities provide a great basis for scaling up today on infrastructure, whether it is in the United States, as Hillary Clinton, one of the candidates. In fact, this is the only thing that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump agree on, that there is a need to revitalize infrastructure. And the same is true here in Europe, including in Germany or Greece, or in virtually all parts of the developing world. The only exception is China. And what is striking is that China invests more in infrastructure than all developing countries put together. And that China invests more in infrastructure than all advanced countries put together. But as the experience of China shows, it needs to be a better infrastructure. And I will come to that later. The second is the future of globalization. In the last few years, for the first time since World War II, world trade has been growing slower than world output. And everywhere there is rising protectionism. But even more importantly, there has been a backlash against globalization. And this is reflected in a new populism. You see that in the Brexit vote. You see that in the political undercurrents here in Europe. And you see it in the US elections, both from the left and from the right. There is a backlash against trade. There is a backlash against investment, and there is a backlash against immigration. Now, this is not just because of globalization, but it is also because of underlying changes in technology and because of a neglect in policies on the impact on the poor and the economically insecure. Particularly, there is heightened economic insecurity because of not just unemployment, but lack of creation of employment, and because of rising inequality. Angus Deaton, who Ambassador Mancini mentioned, and his spouse have shown that there has been rising insecurity in America because of this rising inequality, and it reflects in the politics we are seeing. So there needs to be a new dialogue on inclusive globalization. Professor Larry Summers, an eminent economist from America, talks about responsible nationalism. So national leaders have to be more sensitive to the economic welfare and economic interests of their nationals, but being cognizant of the spillovers on the rest of the world. But I would argue there also needs to be a dialogue on responsible globalization that is more inclusive, that protects the interests of workers and of the disadvantaged in not just advanced economies, but also in emerging markets and developing countries. The third issue that we are facing is living within planetary boundaries. We can already see the devastating impacts of climate change. And the unfortunate fact is that climate change is affecting the most vulnerable populations the worst. In Paris, world leaders reached agreement on a historical climate change agreement. And what is really striking is that countries like US, China, and India have come together in the recognition as well as on commitment on actions. So Paris committed the world to actions to hold global warming to no more than 2 degrees and ideally to 1.5 degrees. But the reality is that on present trajectories, we are likely to hit 3 degrees or higher. So much more is needed. And I would argue that we are in a once-in-a-history moment. Why? Because in the next 20 years, the world will put more infrastructure on the ground than exists on the face of the planet today. Much of that infrastructure will be in emerging markets and developing countries. And if it is done in the same way that we built infrastructure in the past, we will not just miss the climate goal, but we will have unlivable cities, we will kill people, and we will destroy the foundations of economic growth. Today, roughly of the world's population of 7 billion, half live in cities. By 2050, the world population will be 9 billion, and 70% will be living in cities. So the number of people living in cities will increase by more than 2 billion. That provides a tremendous opportunity, but also a tremendous challenge. For much of world history, there were two cities in the world, Rome, here in Europe, and Xi'an in China, that had a population of more than 1 million. By the turn of the 20th century, there were some 10 cities. Today, there are 270 cities with a population more than 1 million. And that will rise to 500 in the next 20 to 30 years. So we have a great opportunity to shape the way in which urbanization takes place, to make a better world for the planet and for its people. Once again, the very low interest rates that we see and the promise of new technology allows us to leapfrog old approaches and build a new future. But as Ambassador Mancini said, it will take completely new cultural approaches than the past, particularly in advanced countries like the United States. And it will require responsibility both by world leaders, both of advanced countries and in emerging markets. In this regard, I have to say that China in this year, through the G20 and its new plan, is showing extraordinary leadership in acknowledging the need for fundamental change in direction. We should welcome it, and we should push other world leaders to show similar leadership. In closing, I want to highlight that 2015 was an extraordinary year of international cooperation at a time of all these difficulties. The world came together through three very important meetings. The ADIS meeting in last July on financing for development, the UN summit in September that agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals, and the 2030 Development Agenda, and as I mentioned, the Paris Agreement on climate change. Today, as a result, we have a new global agenda that is truly universal, that recognizes the need to eliminate poverty and leave no one behind. And that is not just about economics, but about social justice, about peace and security, and about protecting the planet. Delivering on that agenda will require collective action and of countries coming together, not just at the level of government, but businesses, civil society, and the global citizenry. Indeed, in closing, I should pay a tribute to collective efforts of global citizenry like this meeting, indeed, the agreements of 2015 would not have come about if global citizenry did not hold global leaders to account. So we are at a new moment in time. The global economic challenges have never been more complex, but there has never been greater scope for creativity, innovation, and collective commitment. So instead of seeing this as a zero-sum game, as my colleague Fanhe and Ambassador Mancini stressed, we need to come together with a new purpose to fight for a new global order where all countries and where all citizens do their part. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I wish this meeting great success.
Grazie. Grazie.
I would like to thank for this very exhaustive intervention, and I have a question to ask our speakers now. Amar Bhattacharya was talking about the G20 chaired by China, which will be hosted in a few weeks in Hangzhou, which is a vacation city with the first summit that will be chaired by China, as I was saying. So, as Ambassador Mancini said in his introduction, the G20 was founded as legitimating a body for the global economy. It was thought that multilateral were in a way made heavier because of their bureaucratic burden, so it's difficult to have a reform. So the idea was to create this international forum with finance ministers of finance that could help the international community to take decisions. So what we saw is that at the well, the G20 reacted in an efficient way to the crisis and enabled many decisions without which the global economy would have disintegrated. Then, once the impetus, the emergency has been reduced, well, the G20 seems to have lost steam. So, with the contribution of Ambassador Mancini, I also recognize this mandate for the G20, a mandate which is limited in a way, that is to say, to facilitate decisions in economic and financial fields on the short term, and the complexity of global economy as it was seen yesterday. So, I would like Ambassador Mancini to make some comments as far as his aspect and his experience has shown him. And I would like to ask Amar, Bhattacharya and Fan He, what are their expectations for this summit? Particularly, what should we expect? What would be necessary for the leaders to decide in 2 weeks, and what can we will actually see happening. So I'll start with Ambassador Mancini, then I will ask Fan He, and then Aman Bhattacharya. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to, first of all, thank you for the organization of this event that gave us many, a lot of food for thought, our homework, so to speak. As far as your question is concerned, well, there's a philosopher, Ulrich Beck, is German, who recently said that there is a discrepancy, a fundamental discrepancy between being all of us objectively human beings living in a global world on the one hand, and the fact that we don't even realize it on the other. So, well, according to this vision, we are global citizens, but we do not know it. So, well, we all consider the great international organizations of the United Nations or other fora as the G8 and G20 or the European Union. We consider them responsible for our fate because they take decisions that concern us, but without having the possibility to influence these fates. So, well, there is another aspect, which is that, well, our world is truly global. We had here an Italian diplomat, coming from one of the founding member countries of the European Union, 2 scholars, one from China and one who works in the United States, but coming from India. So that is not to be taken for granted that even though they were actually in a way, so to speak, using different alphabets, they were actually speaking the same language. So this is not something to be taken for granted in a world that is as fractured as our world is. So to answer your question, I can say that we have a lot of we need imagination, we need to think about the future, and recently I read an OECD's study according to which with an increasing economic growth, the economy, in order to satisfy our needs, should be 15 times bigger than it is now. Well, it is obvious that this is not possible. It is inconceivable. So if we realize how quick this changes in taking place, and we try and find some solutions, we need to take into account a double policy. On the one hand, we have to ask international organizations to work more and better as the United Nations, the European Union, the G8, and the G20, and all these institutions. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to work with all of them. And on the other hand, and here I go back to something that our colleague, our Indian colleague, said, we need to encourage this global public opinion. We used to be limited to the dimension of a village, of the city, or at least of the country where we used to live, but now we're living in a completely different situation when we have the possibility to communicate everywhere with everyone. And I'm not talking about trading or trade. I'm really talking about simple communication. So we are creating an embryo of a public opinion, which is a planetary public opinion. So we can say when someone, in those countries where there's still the death penalty, we can still hang up on our necks where we say, not in my name. So we have this very small chance, that's very small opportunity to make a difference. There is a beautiful exhibition on Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who was the first one to talk about the small drop of water that makes a difference in the sea. Well, we have this chance. We have this opportunity. In the past, the world was populated by the subjects of the kings, but now we are citizens. So we have the G20, but we're there too. Thank you, Ambassador. And now I'd like the two colleagues to intervene. We don't have much time left at our disposal, so I really have to ask you to be brief.
Okay, thank you. First, I think we have to be realistic about the Hangzhou G20 summit, because one conference cannot solve all the problem of the complexity of the global economy. But I would like to emphasize two issues which, from the perspective of China, we think is very important. And also, I think it will be helpful for the global economy. So one is the global macroeconomic to work closer, and then to of their macroeconomic policy, mainly monetary policy, exchange rate policy, and to some extent fiscal policy, and have a more dialogue and coordination. It will be too ambitious to imagine that G20 can provide a binding system that can guide individual countries. But then we would like to emphasize the importance of coordination, because it seems to us that for some countries, like when we talk with officials from the Federal Reserve, and they still have this uh, the sort of philosophy of invisible hand. So they argue that for individual country, and they will make up their policy decision all by themselves, and then as guided by an invisible hand, and every country will be better off. So probably this may not happen as what we witnessed during the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War. And there was the currency war and trade war, and it's all because of the lack of coordination and cooperation. And even for structural reform, it is true that each country has its own agenda for structural reform. But here, on the platform of G20, we need more peer pressure. And this is what G20 for. So I think there's more things that we can do for sharing information, and then for countries to utilize the G20 platform to facilitate domestic reform in member countries. And second issue is the development issues. China has tried very hard to include development issue in the G20 agenda. And some people say, well, the G20 agenda is becoming all the issues to be discussed are becoming too long, and it will exhaust the resources, and finally it will become more difficult for the implementation of all the proposals has been bring up at the G20 negotiation. I do not buy this argument. Um, well, yeah, as Amar has mentioned, even now there's up down for emerging markets. But then if you look in the long run, and I think we have to admit that emerging market will provide a new momentum for global growth for all kinds of reasons, like they have younger population, and then they have more room for convergence with advanced countries. So helping those developing country is not for the welfare of developing country per se, and it will also help the global economy in general. And the member countries in G20, the 20 countries plus EU themselves cannot solve all the global problems. And if there's only the discussion among these member countries, and probably G20 will lose the legitimacy in the global stage. So to increase its legitimacy, G20 has to outreach to other countries, especially developing countries. So I think the issue of development on G20 agenda is very crucial.
Grazie, Fan. Amar?
Let me just add a few brief points. As you suggested, Domenico, the G20 was founded by crisis, and it has done a reasonably good job with respect to crisis management. Its high point was 2009, but every year since, it is responding to some kind of crisis. The latest is Brexit, the difficulties with European banks, as you well know here in Italy, and with additional geopolitical uncertainties. And having a forum where world finance ministers and their leaders can come together to discuss responses is important, and has been reasonably effective. Where the frustration with the G20 is greater is dealing with longer-term issues, including the vexing problem that I mentioned with inadequate global economic growth. But even there, as Fanhe pointed out, there are productive discussions like on structural reforms. And like him, I think it's extremely important that the G20 engage on development issues, but also on tax cooperation, on financial sector reform, and reform of international institutions. And in each case, the cup is half empty, but it is better than it being completely empty. But there is one aspect where I think the G20 will have to engage more. And that is what Ambassador Mancini was talking about. There needs to be a dialogue on a new global economic order that connects to what global citizens are looking for. So the G20 needs to move from purely technocratic discussions to somewhat more philosophical discussions, and in that engage more with civil society and global citizens in a way, for example, that the United Nations does. I remember when I first got engaged with the G20, at its formation at the finance ministers level in 1999, and Prime Minister Paul Martin of Canada, who was then the head of the group decided to have an engagement on globalization. Because if you remember, at the time there were the Seattle protests and protests here at the Genoa G8 meetings and protests in Washington. And there was a big discussion about what is globalization and how can the G20 define a new globalization. 16 years later, there is a resurgence of that debate, and the G20 needs to define a new globalization. But that one that deals with economic insecurity and rising inequality. So I believe that the G20 should have a proactive discussion on inclusive globalization and the challenges posed for employment and aging of populations. So with that, let me end. Thank you very much.
Bene, ci avviamo allora alla chiusura. Io prima di chiudere
So we are about to finish. I'd like to thank the speakers for their enthusiasm in replying to our invitation. Fanny arrived yesterday from Beijing and is leaving tomorrow to Australia. Amar Bhattacharya, he arrived from the United States. And I'd like to thank you all for staying with us. And I'd like to thank all the voluntaries and the organizers who made all this possible. Thank you.